Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today virtually to hear me talk about my book, Stranger in the Shogun City. Now, usually when I talk about this book, I just kind of tell people what's in it. But today, since I know we have some people here who have already read the book, and also because I know that this is an audience that has many people who are already very knowledgeable about Japan and art, I thought I would take you a little bit more behind the scenes to give you a sense of the materials and especially the visual materials that I used as evidence in constructing the book. So to begin today, I would like to take you back in time. And I'm not going back in time all the way to the 19th century, although I will get there eventually. Instead, I want to take you back in time to about the year 2009, when I was just starting out as an assistant professor at Northwestern. So I had been assigned to teach a survey class on the history of Tokugawa Japan, 1600 to 1868, which is my specialty, to undergraduates, and I was very excited, but I realized that there was not enough material to assign about everyday life, and particularly everyday life in villages. And this was something that has changed in the 10 or so years since, but at the time I was very industrious and I decided I was going to look around for materials and I was going to translate them myself and then assign them to my students. Obviously I had too much time on my hands. But I was clicking around looking for these materials and I landed on the website of the Niigata Prefectural Archives. And I landed here because I'd done some work in Niigata before and I'd been to this archive. But for the first time, I noticed this little place here, the Internetto Komonjo Koza, which translates to the Internet Document Reading Course or lectures. And what this was for local people in Niigata to be able to see the holdings in the archive. So the archive would introduce interesting documents, give you a picture of the original, then give a transcription, and then an explanation of what the document was. So this was perfect for my purposes, and I was clicking through, and I found number 13, which if you can read Japanese, it says Ishigami Mura, Tsuneno ie de shite Edo ni noboru. So Ishigami Mura, Ishigami village Tsuneno leaves her home and goes to Edo. And it showed this visual of a letter from a woman named Tsuneno who had gone to Edo. Well, at the time that I found this, I could not read this at all, like absolutely not. But luckily, as I said, the archive had a transcription available. So I read the transcribed letter. And I was able to produce my own draft translation. This is actually not in the book, but I'm showing it to you here. And it went something like this. The introduction said, I'm writing with spring greetings. As you know, I went to Minagawa-cho in Edo quite unexpectedly, and I ended up in so much trouble. And as I read further, this voice seemed to me to be so vivid and direct and contemporary. And she went on to brag about this wealthy merchant she was working for and how he was constructing a villa for his concubine, the work she was doing, and then the line that really got me, which was, the food here is great, everything I eat is delicious. And those of you who have been to modern Tokyo know that this is in fact still the case. So this was somebody who was writing about 200 years, a little less than 200 years before I showed up. But she sounded just like me in 1997 when I took my first ever trip to Tokyo as a college student. And so just from this transcription, I fell in love with this voice of this woman, Tsuneno. Well, the archive provided a brief synopsis of Tsuneno's life, and it said she had been divorced and run away from her village, ultimately ending up in the service of a famous Edo city magistrate, which is there were two of them, kind of like the chief law enforcement officer in the city of Edo, which of course you know soon became Tokyo in 1868. The archive also said that it had dozens of letters by Tsuneno in the collection. So I visited Niigata as soon as I could, and I spent days in the archive taking pictures of these letters. Now, those of you who are familiar with Japanese letters know that often they can be quite long, like literally very long. They are folded accordion style. You can kind of see the creases here, and spread out, just one of these letters could take up the width of an entire archive table. So there I was with my camera taking pictures down the length of these documents. And even I had to wonder what it was I thought I was doing, because I could not read them at all. I really had no idea. I could read modern Japanese, I could read 19th century Japanese in print, but I could not read Tsuneno's handwriting. And to make matters worse, it wasn't just letters from Tsuneno. There were all kinds of relevant materials that I found in the archive. And soon these few dozen letters turned into hundreds of documents that I was taking pictures of. So you can see there were all different kinds of letters. So this one is a letter from Tsuneno, written in the phonetic alphabet in kana. The background here is a letter from her brother. So it's written in kanji and Chinese characters. And down here, you have the address on a letter. So there are all sorts of different hands and different styles and different languages used in the letters in the collection. And it wasn't just letters. We also had household diaries and records of expenses, which appeared in these booklets that were bound at the top. And we had all sorts of inventories and shopping lists. So lists of prices of gifts or prices of things that people had, or things that people had bought, right, for a wedding, things like that. So there are all sorts of documents, and I couldn't read any of them. Yet I took pictures of all of them. And I was completely obsessed with trying to figure out what was going on with Tsuneno and her family and her village. Eventually, with the help of my Kuzushiji dictionary, which is a dictionary for looking up calligraphic characters, I was finally able to read these sources. And I'm including this picture of my dictionary and my sleeping dog, because you'll see that the dictionary looks absolutely disgusting. And that's because I used it so much that it fell apart and I had to tape it together. And by the end of this project, the dictionary was basically garbage. So I'm sharing this story to tell you how I came to the material in my book. But I'm also trying to let you know something about the kind of materiality, the images of the sources that I used. The letters that I talk about are texts, so you can get the meaning of them from a transcription or from a translation, which I showed you. But without the visual of what these letters look like, you can't understand how they were produced or why they were so difficult to read, or a sense of the culture of writing and sending letters. One interesting thing about the Rinzenji archive, which is held in Niigata, is that people kept copies of their outgoing letters in addition to keeping the correspondence that they'd received. And so there are all sorts of interesting things that you can find in the archive like this. And this is a draft letter, which was scribbled on the back of a sheet of paper that had some sketches of samurai on them. So I have reversed this image and blown it up, and you can see, right, this picture that somebody made a nice little sketch of a samurai, and then they used the back of that paper to write the draft of a letter. It's also interesting to see the envelopes. This is the letter that I showed you before. It's addressed to Tsuneno's mother. And this is a letter that is addressed to Tsuneno's husband. And it is interesting because it says that he's in Edo Toto, he's in Tsukiyabashi, in the residence of the city magistrate, who we're going to talk about a little bit later. So by looking at these things, you can get a sense of the hands that folded the letters and the messengers and the express services in the Edo period that carry these types of letters, this correspondence back and forth. So today I'm going to talk about some of the sources that I used to write this book, and particularly visual sources rather than textual ones, because this is an art society audience. And even though I actually don't include any images in my book, apart from some maps, I did rely heavily on visual materials. So I had maps, woodblock printed books, paintings of landscapes, and even ukiyo-e. And these sources were very important to me because I really realized early on that it was going to be crucial to build out the sensory world of late Edo period Japan. So what things looked like, what they sounded like, how the streets would have appeared to somebody walking through them. And the visual sources helped me do that for people who otherwise would have no idea what early modern Japan, what 19th century Japan would have looked like. So I was aiming at readers who really had no background, and I thought this level of detailed description was going to be very important for them. And of course, the visual sources helped me create that world. But before I get into the details of how that world looked and felt and how I used visual sources to help me think about them, here is the outline of the story, which some of you will already know. So as I just said, the book follows a Buddhist priest's daughter named Tsuneno, and she was born in 1804 in Ishigami village in Echigo province, which is present-day Niigata. And you can see here on the maps in the book, here is the map of Kubiki County in Echigo, which is now Niigata, and here is Ishigami village. So that's where Tsuneno was born. And then when she was only 12 years old, she was sent away to marry a Buddhist priest in Dewa province. And she ended up all the way up here in the town of Oishida, near the Mogami River. The temple that her husband was the head priest of was called Joganji, and actually it is still there in Niigata. The main building has been rebuilt, but this is the bell and the storehouse and the graveyard, which I visited in Yamagata. Tsuneno only lived here in Oishida for about 15 years before the marriage collapsed and she was sent home. And after 2 more disastrous marriages back at home in Echigo, one of which coincided unfortunately with the temple famine, her older brother planned to marry her off for a 4th time. But Tsuneno, who was already in her mid-30s and had been through 3 failed marriages, decided that she would rather die, she said, than, quote, marry some widower in some terrible place. So instead, she pawned her clothes and ran away to the capital city, the Shogun city of Edo, where she lived in a back alley tenement and found work as a maidservant. She married again, this time a man of her choosing. He was a fellow migrant. He was a peasant from the village next to hers in Echigo. She had actually known him as a child, re-encountered him in the city. He had gone to this city to work as a masterless samurai. He was a peasant boy who had essentially reinvented himself. And after Tsuneno married him, she had a very colorful life in Edo, but most of the time she and her husband lived in poverty. Ultimately, however, he got a very prestigious job with the Edo city magistrate, Toyama Kagemoto, or Toyama Saemon no Jo, who is also better known today as Toyama Kinshiro, or Toyama no Kinsan, who is often in TV dramas about the tattooed city magistrate. So you can see this image of him here. And the reason we know that this is where her husband worked is because we have the letters with Toyama Saemon no Jo as the return address. And this is one that Tsuneno wrote when she was calling herself Kin. She says it's from Kin, and she is in the Toyama residence. Tsuneno died in Edo in 1853, just weeks before Commodore Perry's black ships arrived in Edo Bay. So she was among the last generation of people to live and die in Edo. So today I want to talk to you about 3 key locations in the book, Echigo, Oishida, and of course Edo, and show you some of the visual sources I relied upon to create those worlds. You'll notice as I speak that I don't use the images the way that an art historian would. That is, I am not analyzing the constructedness of these images as images. And I'm also not approaching them as a collector would. So the artistry and even sometimes who painted or made the print is not important to me. Rather, I'm trying to figure out whether there is a relationship between these images and some kind of social reality. And that is a question that can be very difficult to answer. So I'm going to walk you through some of these images and show you some of the problems with interpreting them as a historian. So first, let's visit Echigo. So very early in the book, I described this region of Echigo, the snow country, in a passage about Tsuneno's father. Tsuneno's father's name was Emon, and he appears here in this passage. And it says his small temple was in Echigo province at the foot of steep mountains in the heart of Japan's snow country. There, amid thatched roofed wooden houses, grassy fields, and rice paddies, winter had arrived in full force. Emon's neighbors had already mended their straw boots and snowshoes, reinforced their roof beams, wrapped fragile plants in thick woven mats, and hung reed blinds from their windows. By the 11th month, the snow was several feet deep, and more fell almost every day. When the wind picked up, it blew across the fields, piling up in drifts and making it impossible to see the curving pathways and the small canals that traversed the village. So this paragraph is a straightforward description, but it actually relies on 3 different sources, 2 of which qualify as visual sources, and 1 which kind of comes from my experience. So first, the part where I talk about the curving pathways and small canals comes directly from the maps of Ishigami village, which were held in the Rinsenji archive. And so these were maps that the family had drawn or had commissioned in order to show the village, its environs, and landholdings. And there are 2 of them, both date to the, I think this is the late 18th century and this is the early 19th century. And I'm showing them because you can see the canals and the curving pathways, but also because it's a good example of how archives contain text, like letters, but they also often contain these types of images, so things like hand-drawn maps or sketches. And that was very important to me to show me what the village might have looked like. The second source that I relied upon was Suzuki Bokushi's Hokuetsu Seppu, which is a very famous printed book that the first edition was published in 1837, and this is from a later edition a few years later. Hokuetsu Seppu is famous because it is a description of village life in Echigo, but it's also famous for its images. And maybe its most famous images are these pictures, these drawings of snowflakes as seen under a microscope. This is not Bokushi's work, but the work of someone else. They were included in the 1840 edition of this book and became so popular that people started wearing kimono and using other textiles that were printed with snowflake motifs. And Hokuetsu Seppu, this is wrong, Hokuetsu Seppu was a huge bestseller. So it was a very well-known work in its time. Now, you can't necessarily take all of Hokuetsu Seppu literally as a description of life in Echigo, but it was intended to be something that was kind of anthropological. So it explained what life in the snow country was like to an audience that lived in Edo or in other big cities. And so some of the illustrations in the book are meant to be instructive. So this is my favorite 2 pages. This is showing Echigo laborers digging out of the snow. And this is clearing snow from a rooftop. And it also shows all of the different snow implements that people use. So these are the wooden shovels. These are snow coats, straw snow coats, and these are snowshoes. And so Suzuki Bokushi's description of life in Echigo informed the paragraph where I talk about the snow, but also seeing these implements was very important for me in another way, because it made me think about how people who lived in this very harsh climate in the early 19th century, the snow was really life-altering for them, and they needed a completely different wardrobe for the snow. And strangely, this made me think about my own life, which seems like a tangent, but I'll get back to the book in a minute. I live in Chicago, where it snows all winter, and I like shoes, and I have a lot of really nice shoes, but every winter I can't wear any of them to walk to campus because I have to wear snow boots for months and months and months, and I hate it. And seeing these pictures of snowshoes, I thought about Tsuneno, and someone who, because she was a Japanese woman in the early 19th century, would usually be wearing geta, which have no protection for your feet at all, and how different it would have been in the winter, right, when she would have had to wear snow boots. And then thinking about when she went to Edo, where it doesn't snow very much, she could probably wear her geta all year round. And so this informs a sentence later in a completely different chapter of the book. After spending her entire life in Echigo, it was strange for Tsuneno to walk on muddy streets in her everyday shoes at a time of year, in her everyday sandals at a time of year when she would ordinarily need snowshoes. So that is partly evidence from image, and it's partly evidence from my own experience of the world. And that evidence from experience in a different way comes out in another place in the original quote about Echigo too. So in that original quote about Echigo, I described the snow blowing across the fields and how people couldn't see. And I know this because I went to this area of Echigo. This is me in Joetsu under a sign that says Ishigami. So this is the site of Tsuneno's village. I was there in early winter and it had not started snowing yet, so I didn't get to see the snow blowing across the fields. But my guide there was a Japanese scholar named Asakura Yuko, who very kindly took me around, and she showed me the straight streets now, roads going through the rice fields, and she said they have to be heated underneath so that people can see them, because it snows so much and blows so much that the streets get entirely whited out. So from that, I could imagine that in the 19th century, the snow blew across the rice fields in the same way. What's interesting to me about that type of evidence is it's not citable. So it does not appear in the footnotes to my book. There is no way to footnote. By the way, I went to Niigata and I realized that the snow blows across the rice fields, but it was evidence that I used nonetheless. The book's description of the river town of Oishida is also a case where the visual sources were really valuable, but where they were also deceiving. So the paragraphs where Tsuneno arrives in Oishida are here. And I have this extended description of the cultivation of safflowers, which blanketed the valleys to the south of town in fields of vivid gold. And then I say that Tsuneno was born and raised in the rice fields of Ishigami, but she came of age amid the tiled warehouses and white sails of Oishida. So the description of safflower cultivation comes from a source that's a little bit like Suzuki Bokushi's Hokuetsu Seppu, in that it's supposed to be a kind of explication of rural life. Yet instead of an illustrated book, it is a painted scroll, and it's colloquially called the Benibana Emaki, the safflower picture scroll. So apparently, paintings of safflower cultivation were a kind of mini genre, and there were some famous artists, including Kano school artists, who painted safflower cultivation in the area around Oishida. This scroll that I used was by an anonymous artist sometime in the early 19th century, and it was found in Yamagata in the 1950s in the collection of a private individual. But it is really interesting because it shows the cultivation of safflowers. It shows the peasants out in the field harvesting the buds, the way I described in the book. It also shows them processing and making the compact yellow-orange discs that I describe in the book. And it also shows images of them selling these to merchants who would come to buy them, who would ultimately transport them to Kyoto. Now, I did run into a problem here, however, because you might remember that in that original passage, I described fields of vivid gold. Well, if you look at the Benibana picture scroll, these look more green than gold. And in fact, a reader for my manuscript picked up on this and said, Amy, I think the safflower fields are more green than gold. So I had to think about this. And I thought, well, okay, they're harvesting buds. And then I went on Google image search to look for images of safflowers in Yamagata. I'd actually seen some of these myself, but I wanted to make sure. And sure enough, mature safflowers do look golden, so I kept the description in. This is one of many times that I had to go back and check a color, as you'll see later. So the use of those images to describe safflower production was pretty straightforward, but I got in trouble with the next image. So luckily, there is a rare painting of the river town of Oishida that still survives. And this is a very pixelated image, for which I apologize. I don't have a better image, but there's a huge reproduction of it in the Oishida History Museum in Oishida, which I visited. And in that painting, you can see the way that the town looked, how it was laid out. You can see the white sailed boats that I described being in the dock. You can also see, although you can't read it here, this is Tsuneno's husband's temple, Joganji, which is labeled on the map. So I could get a sense of the layout of the town, which I could also get a sense of by going there and visiting. So originally, I wrote my description of this town, and I talked about the tiled roofs, and I talked about them being red tiled roofs, because the red in this painting is very striking. But when I went to Oishida, and I talked to the museum curator there, I was having a conversation with him. His name's Otani Toshitsugu. And I said, you know, this red is really striking. And he said, yes, it's strange that the roofs are red because we know that the roofs around here were not red. They were actually gray like normal roofs. So it seems that the artist used this red for effect, and I struck the word red from my description of the tiled roofs in Oishida. And that just shows that it can be very important to actually go to a place and talk to the people who know the images best in order to understand what they are really depicting. But enough about the provinces. I know most of you are here to hear about Edo. And of course, Edo is a place where the visual record is really deep and fascinating. And in some ways, it's the opposite of the situation in villages. So in villages, we have a lot of archival material that is text because village headmen ran the villages and they had to collect all these documents as precedent. And as a result, there are families all over the provinces who had huge collections of documentary material. And because of that, you know, the Rinsenji archive is just the tip of the iceberg. There are hundreds more Tsunenos all over Japan just waiting to be discovered in these archives. Edo is kind of the opposite. Edo has this wonderful visual record, but the documentary record, in comparison to a city of its size, it had 1.2 million people or so in 1800, is sparse. And the reason for that is twofold. One is that the city burned a lot, so the documents burned too. And the other is that people tended to be more transient. So you don't have people kind of sitting on family archives in the city of Tokyo as much as you do in the provinces. But in order to compensate, in Edo, we have this wonderful visual record. We have prints, paintings, maps, and all kinds of artistic representations of life in the city. One great and really well-known example is the scroll from the early 19th century, Kirai Shoran, which you might be familiar with because there's a big reproduction of it in Mitsukoshi-mae Station in Tokyo. This painting is actually held in the Berlin Museum of Asian Art, and it depicts an Edo street scene that goes from Nihonbashi, which you can see the edge of here, and then all the way to Imagawabashi. And this is just a little section of a much longer painting. So it shows life in the commercial heart of Edo in around 1805. And the great historian of Edo, Yoshida Nobuyuki, has done a lot of work on this scroll and has a fantastic book about it, in which he and his collaborators have been able to verify that this was intended to be an accurate description of the buildings and the storefronts along this stretch of street. You can also see a lot of Edo types in this painting. You can see street vendors, students going to classes. You can see the fish market near Nihonbashi. You can see the people selling vegetables on the bridge. You can see samurai on errands, servants carrying packages. All in all, there are 1,600 figures depicted in the scroll, of which 200 are women. And this is another opportunity to think about the relationship between kind of the visual depiction and the reality of life in Edo. Why are there only 200 women out of 1,600 figures? In some sense, you know, women are underrepresented in the population of Edo, but they're not underrepresented to that extent. So is this a faithful depiction because women weren't out on the street as much? Or is it that, like in American movies, when people try to depict reality, they overrepresent men and underrepresent women? In the end, I was not able to answer that question, but you can look at this depiction of Nihonbashi and see where my description of crossing Nihonbashi Bridge in the book comes from. So I talk about the peasants selling their vegetables, everybody being in that hurry, being able to see the castle, and also being able to see Mount Fuji, which of course always appears in the background when people depict Nihonbashi. And I talk about the warehouses that turn their broad white backs to the water. Another great thing about the visual record of Edo is that there's a lot of ephemera. So things that were published in a specific moment in time meant to be consumed in a timely fashion and then possibly thrown away. And this is good because you can pinpoint a date and a year and find materials from that specific time. So for example, I wanted to describe what was going on in the city around the new year of 1840. And so I looked in the MFA collection and I could find they have a huge collection of playbills, which you can search online. And I found the production that was playing at the Kawarazaki Theater in the first month of 1840. And I was able to say, okay, this is the name of the production. And then I could cross-reference and look for prints of that production, which I found in the British Museum. But here again, there's a problem with images and their use. So I talked to the theater historian, theater scholar Satoko Shimazaki at UCLA about this image. And she said, you know, that image doesn't actually tell you, I mean, it's meant to advertise the play, doesn't tell you what the actor actually wore on stage. It also doesn't tell you whether that scene was really performed. The prints kind of had a life of their own, and they were produced before the play happened. So what this tells me then is not what this actor wore on stage, but rather what was fashionable, what people wanted to see people wearing in the new year of 1840. And so when I described what was going on in early 1840, I talked about the portraits of anonymous beautiful women and advertisements for kabuki performances that gave Tsuneno some idea of what the most fashionable people in the city were wearing. And then I described Onoe Saburo's outfit in that painting, in that print, but I do not say that's what he wore on stage. So there are other sources too that gave me a better sense of what Edo looked like that were not necessarily very striking visual sources like the print that I just used. Some of the most interesting and accurate sources about what the city looked and felt like were kind of materials that seem a little bit mundane, that belong to the Archive of Public Information. So things like maps. Maps of the city were interesting and informative to me in all kinds of ways. So for example, I found a map of Edo, a printed map in the Rinsenshi collection. And that told me that the family in Echigo was interested in Edo, interested enough to collect maps and materials about it. There was another map in the collection. This is Tsuneno's brother's hand-drawn map of the relocated theater district after the temple reforms. So although this is a manuscript map and this is a printed map, they appeared in the same collection and gave me the same idea, which was this is the family that's very engaged in what's happening in the city. But there are other maps that were useful to me in a different way in writing descriptions. So at one point, I have a long description of what the tenement looked like where Tsuneno lived in Minagawa-cho. I got this based on a map of the block next door, which appeared in Katakura Hisako's book, Edo no Jutaku Jijo. And I don't have that map here, but what she was using was a kind of map that was called kokken. So they were maps that would show land ownership and value of different city blocks in Edo. And if you go to the National Diet Library's digital site and you search kokken, you can find all sorts of these for blocks all over Edo. And what they show is the plots of land, which are kind of long and narrow coming back from the main streets, who owned them and how much they were worth. But that's not all you can see. Usually you cannot see the buildings, so you can't see how many tenement buildings there were crowded into these lots, but they will show you the location of wells in the back alleys. And here, if you zoom in, there's the well, there are the toilets, urinals, and this is the box for night soil. So you can see all kinds of interesting details in this map. So those were the maps that I used to get a sense of layout. And others I used to orient myself so that I could see the city through Tsuneno's eyes. So for example, by comparing a printed map of the entire city and one of these maps, of more detailed maps of city neighborhoods, which are called kiriezu, I could trace the path of the Nakasendo Highway through the city of Edo and understand what Tsuneno saw on her way into the city, including the compound of the Lord of Kaga domain, which is marked on this kiriezu map. And there's another way that I use these kiriezu because they told me not only the locations of specific places, but also how people conceived of the city. So the best example of this is when Tsuneno first went to work as a maidservant, she lived in Minagawa-cho in Kanda and worked at Matsudaira Tomosaburo's mansion. Matsudaira Tomosaburo was a bannerman. And when I read the letter, these were just names on a page to me. I did not understand how these two places were related. But when I looked at the Kiriezu, I could find Tomosaburo's mansion marked on the Surugadai map. And I could also find Minagawacho mapped on the Kanda map. By putting these two maps together, right, so joining them where they would overlap, I could see that in fact Minagawacho is right near Tomosaburo's mansion. So I could tell that these were just steps away, but I could also tell by the fact that they appeared on different neighborhood maps that people conceived of these places as belonging to different neighborhoods, the commoner neighborhood of Kanda and the samurai neighborhood of Surugadai. So when I write in the book about Tsuneno going to Matsudaira, Tomosaburo's mansion, I write, every morning she went out through the tenement gate, walked the short distance into a samurai district, and entered yet another of Edo's new worlds. So those were the kinds of things that I wanted to show you today to give you a sense of how I did the research for this book and how visual sources informed my descriptions. And I hope that it provides just a little bit of an introduction for those who haven't read the book yet and an explanation for those of you who already have read it. I am happy now to answer questions. And if I don't get to your question, this is my contact information, my email, my Twitter, and my website. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Stanley. That was fantastic. We have a bunch of questions in the Q&A for you. We're going to start with a really simple one from Sarah Pratt. She asks if there are any images of Tsuneno.
There are no images of Tsuneno, and in fact, we have no idea what she looked like because this is not something that people discussed in letters. And if you think about this, right, if somebody were to look through your email archive, that were just looking at emails from, say, your coworkers and your family members, how many of them would have talked about what color your hair was or what your eyes look like? This is not information that people write to each other because they already know it. And so one of my challenges was to write about a woman who was a commoner who didn't have anybody painting her portrait and to have no information whatsoever about how she looked. And if you think about other biographies of women, they almost all lead with a description of the protagonist because women's beauty or lack thereof was so important to determining their lives and their life chances. I didn't have any of it. I wish I did, but it's just lost.
That's too bad, but I mean, it's just fantastic the amount of information you were able to pull about her life. It's so cool.
People used to say to me, oh, she must have been very beautiful because of course she married in the end 5 times. But I don't know whether, I mean, she might have been very beautiful or it might have been something else captivating about her personality, or it might have been her family and their wealth and influence. So who knows? I would love to know though.
Would be very cool. So as you can guess, the majority of the questions are about marriage.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So Tom Burnett asks, please discuss the concept of divorce, which was not frowned upon in Japan at this time.
Yes, so this is very important. So the way that people conceived of marriage was a way of kind of consolidating and also extending the family so that most marriages were arranged. Tsuneno's last marriages were not arranged, but for the most part they were by the parents. And if you think about that, right, you realize that if you are going to choose, let's say you're choosing a bride for your son, although you could be choosing a son-in-law for your daughter, it went both ways. But let's say you're choosing a bride for your son. She's going to come live with you and she is going to take over the household after you die. If she and your son don't get along, or if you don't like her at all, that's a very difficult relationship to be stuck with for the rest of your life. So the way around this was to make divorce incredibly, by our standards, liberal. So that people often, if they didn't find the right fit for their family, would send back brides, as what happens to Tsuneno, or even sons-in-law. Technically, divorce had to be initiated by the man who would write a famous kind of 3.5-line letter that would say, you know, I divorce you, you're free to marry someone else. But in reality, there was often a lot of negotiation and compromise from both sides. And that's why, although it is surprising to us, it's quite common to see Tokugawa period people who married 2, 3, even 4 times.
So even, because a couple of questions are about what were the repercussions specifically for women to be married multiple times? Because I feel like for men, that's more common just globally, but was it a major issue for a woman to be married 2 or 3 times?
No, in fact, it was not. So sometimes there could be problems behind the marriage, right? So a reason why a woman kept getting divorced. And we don't really have a sense of that in Tsuneno's case. We do know that, or we can guess with most accuracy, that she never had children. So it could be that she was incapable of having children, but in most cases that wouldn't have ended a marriage because people adopted a lot. So it's unlikely that that was the main problem with her. It might have been that she was difficult to get along with. And so she was divorced, but you can see that even after she was divorced, her family had no problem finding other men to marry her. And you might say, okay, well, this is because this is a temple family and they're not quite commoners, but they're not samurai. But interestingly, I just went to a presentation by the historian Luke Roberts, who is looking at marriage and divorce in samurai families. And he found that in samurai families too, women married and divorced a lot. Even women who were divorced for adultery ended up being married again. So it's a lot different than you might imagine if you were just to guess what was happening with marriage in the Tokugawa period.
That's really wild and more liberal than I would have expected.
Yeah.
We have a question. How was Tsuneno's dowry treated during her divorces?
Oh, that's very important. So she brought all of these clothes with her to Oishida, and they had to send all the clothes back. And there was a huge fire at that temple Joganji while she was there, but we know that her wardrobe survived because eventually it got sent back to Rinsenji. The other problem was there was often money exchanged during an engagement. And in Tsuneno's second marriage, her in-laws gave her family money to help her prepare her trousseau. And when she was divorced, her family was worried they were going to have to pay that money back, and they didn't have it. It was 15 euro. But luckily, the family agreed that they could keep the money. So usually in the divorce, the woman brought her stuff back with her to her natal family.
That is also really interesting. But this is just all really cool. This is stuff I'd never thought about before, and I think it's wonderful that you've sort of brought this to the forefront. This is really great. There is a question from Victoria Rabar, who is wondering about kimono that have been repurposed by women. We know that Tsuneno was really good at sewing. Mm-hmm. And Victoria says that in the Tokyo National Museum, it has a collection of kimono which have been repurposed by women to be used as thick, heavy blankets by breaking the seams, stuffing them, and then resewing them. She's wondering if this is something Tsuneno would have done, repurposing her clothing growing up in the snow country. Do you know?
I have one example of that in the book, which is a blanket. Yet this family argues about the stupidest things, but it's wonderful for me because I can see all of their mundane arguments. But they had a whole argument about a child-sized blanket that was left at Rinsenji that Tsuneno encountered after she had already been in Edo, after she'd been divorced 4 times, when she was in her 40s, it must have been. And it had been made out of her old clothes. And so she found this blanket and she said, well, this is my blanket. And her brother said, well, we've had this blanket in the temple for decades. That's not your blanket, that's our blanket. They had a whole dispute about it. But it's wonderful because it does show that Tsuneno's clothes were recycled into other kinds of textiles, in this case, a blanket.
Yes, I remember that from the book, and I thought that was so funny. And you were like, oh, in the end, he just gave it to her because it's not worth fighting, because she was so stubborn.
I mean, that was basically what happened. She would fight with her brother. Her brother would say she was selfish and stupid, and then he would just give in because there was nothing that he could do.
I kind of love that dynamic. So there's a question about the pawn shop industry, about hawking kimonos, and someone wonders if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, so this is really important, and it's something that I did a lot of research on. I wrote a different paper, which appears in an edited volume by Beth Berry and Marcia Yonemoto about the family, and I trace what happened to Tsuneno's wardrobe and what happened with pawning. Because of course, pawning is very important as a way to raise cash when you don't have access to credit. And it was also important, I argue, for women, because women didn't necessarily have access to cash, but they did have access to the family's wardrobe because they were the ones who were responsible for sewing and laundering and storing clothes. So when women needed money, and this is a global phenomenon, it's not just in Japan, it's everywhere. When women needed money, they pawned their clothes. And you can often see in kabuki plays, when someone is a really evil villain, he steals his wife's trousseau and he pawns it because he's taking the kind of the credit or the money that should have belonged to her and he's stealing it for himself. So the idea of pawning clothes was very important in enabling her to access cash. And we can see from her letters that she understood how pawn shops function. So even though she was what we would think of as kind of upper middle class, a bourgeois type person, she understood the concept of pawning and interest and how much she would have to pay to get her stuff back. And of course, there were pawn shops all over Echigo, in addition to being all over Edo. These were things that they existed in the countryside and in the cities.
Thank you. There's a question from David Okada. He asks, during the 1800s, there were a lot of fires, especially in Edo. There were about 506 fires between 1851 and 1867. Were there descriptions of any of that occurring in Edo from Tsuneno?
Tsuneno does not write about the fires that I can remember. However, when I was describing Tsuneno's life in the city, I cross-referenced her letters with, and it's to figure out where she was in the city, with diaries. So one was Saito Geshin, who wrote a diary. He was a village headman who was also a writer. He wrote Edo Meishozue. And also Fujioka Yaniki, which is a news diary. And from there, I could see that the city burned, of course, a lot during her time there, that there was a fire more or less in her neighborhood while she was living in Minagawa-cho for those first few months. And also that eventually Matsudaira Tomosaburo, that original bannerman that she was working for, that his mansion burned down in a fire years later. So the fires were important, and I talk about them a lot in the book, but she does not write about them in her letters. Her letters are mostly personal, descriptions of whether she's doing well or badly, descriptions of the clothes she wants, announcements of presents she's sending, inquiries into people's health, but it's not, there is no category of current events or, you know, kind of happenings, except for on one occasion, she does say that she was unable to do something because she was in the household of the city magistrate and they were preparing for the city magistrate's audience with the Shogun. So that's the one time in which we would consider like a big event comes into her letters, but otherwise they're devoid of that kind of context.
That's so interesting that she would just make them so specific. And there's another question from John Stanley who sort of plays into that. He says, I believe you noted that you relied on letters to the family and other materials from the family. Were there any descriptions of Tsuneno and the work she did from the family she worked in?
I would love to have that, and I don't have it. One thing is, so Matsudaira Tomosaburo, as far as I can tell, does not have any documents associated with him. He ended up being a daimyo in some other domain toward the end of the Edo period. And he actually became a somewhat politically important figure, but there's nothing that I could find about how his household functions. Now, interestingly, Toyama, the magistrate, did have a household diary that described the work of his retainers and some of the servants, but it does not mention Tsuneno or her husband by name. And the problem with looking for Tsuneno in these documents would be that she wouldn't have worked under the name Tsuneno. And she probably even wouldn't have worked under the name Kin, which is what she took when she married for the last time. She might have worked under a completely different name and be referred to in the household documents as that person. And so I had no way of making that connection.
Thank you. So we're going to pivot because now a lot of questions are about specifically your process in writing this. So Veronica Miller asks, were you ever tempted to write this as a historical novel?
I wasn't, because I have no imagination. But what I really wanted to do, I'm really interested in what is the difference between history and fiction. And my inspiration in writing this book actually was historical fiction. The thing that I read in the course of writing this book that most inspired me was Hilary Mantel's historical novel, Wolf Hall. And the reason why I was so inspired by it was that she takes this character and she gets inside his head, which I cannot do because I'm a historian. I cannot tell you what Tsuneno was thinking because I have no evidence. But she really builds out Cromwell's world with a focus on the kind of mundane descriptions of everyday life. So like the dust and the way the clothes looked, and there's a lot about food, right? And so it inspired me to think about what is the difference between fictional representation and a historical representation in the mode that history is usually written. And most of the time, historians do their research kind of up here in kind of concepts and events and important people and trends and kind of abstract, like capitalism or the market or ideas about gender, right, which is my first book. But I wanted to bring the reader as close to the ground as possible. And to do that, I had to have a completely different research strategy. So instead of thinking about how were women's lives different from men's lives, which I thought about in the course of writing the book, I would think about things like, what was going on in Edo in 1840? How can I find every single thing I can about what happened in the first month of 1840? And found that I could really find a lot. And that's one of the blessings of the deep archival record that we have in Japan, is you really can build out so many of those details while remaining completely accurate. So that was the kind of problem that I set to myself, right? Is how far can you go writing something that reads somewhat like a novel while also being completely faithful to what we know of the historical record and not engaging in speculation that is not explicitly marked as speculation. I don't know whether I succeeded, but I do know that a lot of people who have read my book are under the misconception that it is fiction. And then they're disappointed because it's not great fiction. If I had written it as fiction, I would have written it differently. I would have made her survive to see Perry's ships, for example. I would have had her survive as far into the Meiji period as I possibly could. But this is one of the ways in which history and fiction have to be different, is I had to work with what I was given. And it was fun to work within that constraint, like a puzzle, to say, how much can I make out of this, given what I know and what I can never know?
Thank you. So there's a question from Henry Smith, and this might be our last one since we only have 5 minutes left. He says, some reviews of your book have said that it reads like a novel, which is certainly part of its appeal. But could you imagine a book based on Tsuneno that was openly fictional, fleshing out her story in ways that filled in all the gaps? How might it be different from, well, you actually said that, but how might it be different from what you already wrote?
Yeah, I think to answer that question, first of all, we would know what she looked like, right? So there would be a description of the protagonist. You would know things about her first marriage that I was not able to write about in the book. That first marriage in Oishida is mostly blank. It's just a gap. And I would love to know what happened and why that marriage failed. I would also like to know more about her story with her final husband. Why is it that she divorced him and then went right back there, even though she complained about him all the time? Those things you can write about in fiction, and you can't necessarily get a sense of from the documentary record. But to kind of close with a final thought on this, I've been thinking a lot about what is the difference between history and fiction, and why do trade press readers, like kind of general readers, want to read the types of history that they want to read. And one of the things that we often complain about in feminist history or in Japanese history is that people only like to buy trade books about dead great white men. So they'll buy, George Washington and Napoleon, but you can't write a book about an anonymous Japanese woman. Hopefully I've proved that that's not entirely the case, but to think about why, I think, is interesting. And it is, in fact, because, these great men have immediate name appeal. They have a brand. You know what you're getting with George Washington. But I also think it's because when you write fiction, it has to feel true. It doesn't have to be true, but it has to make people feel, it feels plausible, right? And so the psychology of people is really built out so you can understand why they're making the decisions they're making. That's kind of the pleasure of fiction, right? Or one of them. In history, you can do that if you have someone like George Washington, or if you have someone like Thomas Jefferson, who wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote about himself all the time and was so famous that other people wrote about him all the time and described his psychology, and you can kind of think about it endlessly. in stories, in histories of ordinary people, especially in the 19th century, and especially women, you don't have that psychological depth because you don't have people obsessing about their own character and other people also kind of writing these detailed portraits, right? So the privilege of people who write about famous men is that they can write history that is true and also feels true. And I can write history that is true, but it doesn't give you quite that feeling of truth that historical fiction would have because I can't build out the psychology.
I just feel like you could because I think you're very talented. But we're at the end of this, so thank you so much. I'm going to hand the microphone over to Allison Tolman, but thank you again so much, Professor Stanley.
Yes, Amy, thank you very, very much. I think that your point about the dead white men is true, but I think that you, through your writing, gave Tsuneno a voice and other women like her. And I think we who have attended this talk today will be very curious to see what next book you'll come up with. Can you share with us very quickly if you're working on any other projects, or are you just recovering from having written this one?
I am recovering from having this one, and I am homeschooling 2 children for the foreseeable future. So any book project that I might be working on is unfortunately extremely delayed, but hopefully there will be something sometime in the future, which I can't quite imagine right now.
Well, we look forward to it, and thank you so much to all of those people who attended tonight. Thank you very much, and please write us with your comments and suggestions. I would also like to invite you, Amy, and everyone to our next webinar, which will be Tuesday, September 22nd at 5 p.m. East Coast time. Dr. Sinead Vilbar, Curator of Japanese Art at the Cleveland Museum of Art, will be talking about Kami in Cleveland, creating the exhibition Discovery of the Divine in Japanese Art. So we will hope to see you there then. But all of you, thank you so much. And till the next time, thank you. Night.
Thank you.